Is 9:05. Azraf, Shehzad, Meg, we're cool to get started? Okay. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you're joining us from West Coast Turtle Island, it's going to be pretty early in the day, so good morning to you. And if you are joining us from any other part of the world, especially if you're joining us from Bangladesh or South Asia or at large, I hope it's been a very good evening. From what I've heard from our panelists, it's been a very lively day, an active day in the street politics and general lively politics of Bangladesh. So we're very happy that people are joining us indeed. The event will be recorded for anybody who will be missing today's live discussion. So you can check it out later. Captions should be enabled. So if you have any accessibility issues in that regard, please let us know if you're having any difficulty with that. Kylie and I from the center will do our best to address those concerns. If you have trouble hearing any of the participants, just let us know, and we will do our best to, project ourselves a little bit better. And yeah, let's get started. I'm going to get started with the land acknowledgement, since this recording, this event is taking place from the premises of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. We should respectfully acknowledge that this university is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katsi, Coquitlam, Kaikat, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Swasan peoples. It is stolen land. It is something that we are in active struggle against. This is something that we should be constantly aware of, and perhaps we can try to mobilize around as well. A little bit about the hosting institution. The Center for Comparative Muslim Studies is an academic unit at Simon Fraser University. Our main goal is to foster academic and public discussion and understanding of Muslim societies and cultures. Everything from presentations on political and economic issues and developments in South Asia to anthropological approaches to history in the modern Middle East. Now, I spoke about the chat. That's basically going to be our Q&A function for you to, while presenters are, presenting, you can, talk about technical issues that you're having. But please be cordial. Don't be nasty in the chats, especially for Q&A as well. If anybody is saying anything heinous, anything that is racist, Islamophobic, transphobic, etc., you will be removed. We have a very low tolerance on those issues. Please respect the speakers and everybody else in the room who's participating, and other attendees as well. That's it for me. I'm just going to introduce our moderator for the day, the incredible Azraf. Uddin Ahmad is a PhD candidate at the Department of Economics at Simon Fraser University and a lecturer at BRAC University. His research focuses on various development issues facing Bangladesh using applied macroeconomics, and I'm very happy to be working with him, and he is a dear friend and comrade. Azraf, take it away.
Hi. Thanks to everyone for joining. And thanks for the kind introduction. Before we get started, I guess I should take a moment to introduce our primary speakers for the evening. First, in no particular order, we have Meg. Meg is the current president of the Bangladesh Student Union at Dhaka University. Ever since I've known Meg, and it's been a while now, he has been very involved in the political life at Dhaka University and has actively been organizing against Army League student wing, the Chatu League, for many years. Meg is one of the most insightful political commentators that I've seen in Bangladesh, and I'm really excited to hear more from him. And secondly, we have Shehzad Arifeen. Shehzad is a PhD candidate at the University of Texas, Austin, and a senior lecturer at BRAC University, incidentally, where he once taught me. His research focuses on the infrastructure-led development and post-colonial state building in Bangladesh. And some of his research is a lot of his research, in fact, all of his research is incredibly insightful. And I find his political commentary extremely insightful. So again, very excited to hear him talk, but also see what he and Meg come up with today, right? With that, let's get started, right? And I thought it would be useful to start, I guess, with a brief overview about how we sort of arrived at the events of July 2024, because I guess a lot of our audience today might not be from Bangladesh or not familiar with the political developments in Bangladesh. So as a broad reminder, there is currently a transitional interim government in power. And it's quite funny that after our last sort of experience with the caretaker government, Awami League won a 2/3 majority in 2008 general election. And so the question that I guess I would have for our panelists to start with is that how would you describe how Awami League sort of consolidated its grip on power in the sort of decade and a half since 2008 till we got to 2004? So yeah, whoever wants to go first.
I think you should pick one.
Okay, then I guess Shehzad.
Should I go?
Yeah.
If Meg wants to go first, it's okay.
Sure, Meg. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Meg, you can go first.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's quite a pleasure to be talking here. I've known Azraf for a very long time. It's a delight to be here and to sort of be in a program where Azraf is hosting. I think to go to the starting question that Azraf asked of how our League sort of took over power and consolidated powers in such a way that it took mass uprising to uproot them from the government. I think one of the most easy but oftentimes ignored fact is the electoral system of Bangladesh. I think a lot of people who live in America can sort of relate to this because we also have a first past the post system that essentially makes it it doesn't matter which are the two parties, but it essentially comes down to a two-party system because you're always voting for the lesser of two evils. That's how the system is built. So, for example, there is no proportional representation. So, despite Bangladesh being a very pluralistic country in terms of politics, and there being a lot of open opinions, it oftentimes turns to our League versus BNP because we are trying to mitigate harm. People who think BNP is the bigger harm used to vote for Awami League and vice versa. That's why in 2008, while Awami League did not get 2/3 majority in terms of vote share, it actually did not even get the majority of the vote share, but because how the system functions, it actually got 230 out of the 300 seats available in parliament. So I think that's an easy answer, but something that is very important for anyone who's trying to address or understand these things from an academic perspective. I think another very important subject which hasn't been dealt with even now is that Awami League used to be seen as the savior of marginalized communities in Bangladesh, be it the Hindu community, which is a big minority, big in terms of it's almost 10% of the population. So it's a significant minority community in Bangladesh. I also belong to the community. There are people who are indigenous who thought that Awami League is the safeguard of indigenous people. Women's rights activists, people of so-called liberals, progressives, and all of those people sort of saw Awami League as the lesser of two evils. So though even from 2009-10 onwards, though there was this kind of a lot of things that were happening that were concerning, oftentimes the critique that came from the left or the critique that came from liberals were not actually that big of a deal, because though they were protesting those issues, inside their head, they were also thinking, if not Awami League, then who? There was this famous line in Bangladesh called Bikolpoke, like asking what's the alternative. Interestingly enough, that question hasn't been dealt with even now. So I think if you ask me, that would be the two primary reasons. Like if essentially those who are traditionally against autocratic rule, traditionally against fascistic rules, were for a very long time seeing Awami League as a lesser of two evil. And at the same time, because of the electoral system, Awami League got a disproportionate amount of power in parliament, despite their voting share not being, meriting them having that kind of power in politics. So I think that would be the sort of initial understanding of why Awami League got so powerful.
Shehzad bhai, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, sorry, I know my volume isn't great, so I hope people can hear me. And Azraf, please interrupt me and tell me if I'm fading out. So I think Meg made some excellent points about the electoral system and generally speaking, the political field that allowed, the shape of the political field that allowed the Awami League to basically overpower everybody else. I think what another aspect of this that I would like to focus on is their development model. So by their second term in power, I think the Awami League regime had basically made a giant gamble, and the gamble was that they are going to open up Bangladesh for business, pump it full of money, and basically try to control it through patronage. So this is not particularly unique or new. In many post-colonial nation states have tried this. It's in what Gramsci would call passive revolution. So an elite or state-led effort to revolutionize or catalyze economic development while neutralizing competition or absorbing the competition. That's something that the Awami League did very well. Even the people who were ideologically at polar opposites, many of them who are today very active, were actually, had become complicit in the Awami League regime. And that's something that they did very well. And part of that was that their ability to pump Bangladesh full of money, allow massive accumulation. And not all of that was, unreal. A lot of that was real development, but it came at a hefty price, incredible land grabbing, tremendous amount of investment in labor discipline, and probably the worst of all, which we're dealing with, is financial license and crime, it's money laundering, bank fraud, and defaulting. So at some point, it had become the gamble was starting to lose steam, or in another way of thinking about it is that they were incredibly in debt, and they were betting on the future, and they were betting on their being able to stay long enough that they would be able to pay back the amount of debt that was in the system. And that's something that started to basically overpower the system. It fed an oligarchy, most of whom, by the way, are still there and quite active. Massive conglomerates who made massive fortunes. Some of that wealth trickled down, but you had to basically insert yourself into networks of patronage, right? And that's the big other thing. It was patronage that basically decided who is going to be, who's going to be a part of this model, and you basically had to buy into the political project, and they were trying to entice people to buy in. And it was not really an ideological program. I think a lot of people jumped ship from the BNP, which is the main opposition, and basically bought in because they realized, that there was some kind of future here. And this patronage, many post-colonial nation states tried this. Probably the best example, most successful example of passive revolution is Singapore. And the word passive here definitely doesn't mean that it's pleasant or straightforward. It's a bloody process. But I guess that's what the Awami League thought that it was trying to do. But at the same time, it had sold off the party to the highest bidder. Anybody could basically swear loyalty by making enough money. And that's something that allowed them to basically become gradually a de facto one party state, and destroy the boundary between government and state and party. It's not the party rule. It's not, I don't know. I'm not that familiar with China, but the party rule was not ideological as far as I can tell. And I think Meg would agree as well. Party rule was basically about money and swearing fealty to the queen in that case. And that's the part of the story of how they managed to subvert pretty much every institution. And I think one thing that we really need to understand is by being able to do something that nobody had been able to do before, Right? We had explicitly autocratic governments before. We had military governments before, but we did not have a democratically elected government which was able to basically engineer elections again and again and again and stay in power for that long. But the fact that this party was able to stay in power for that long, basically, this is what I think, basically shifted the balance of power, because Bangladesh is not run by just one group of people. We have you know global capital flows. We have the development industry, the NGO industry. We have institutions like the army. You have political parties. You have religion. You have all kinds of stuff. And there was some kind of balance throughout the 90s and the 2000s, because no political party could basically rise above them. Every political party at one point had to swear fealty to the NGO system, in a sense, and civil society. But by being able to basically show people that no matter what, we're going to stay in power, they actually were able to bend civil society, NGOs, pretty much every institution to their will, and everybody began to buy into that. So I think that's the other aspect of how they were able to become what they were. I don't know how much of that you got. Azraf, you're muted.
We did hear it, but if you could just speak perhaps a bit louder. Yeah. Thanks. Right. So there's a lot to unpack there. But I guess perhaps I want to go back to this idea of sort of institutions, right? One sort of narrative that I guess I might be interested in is like a capture of, like, let's say, the judicial system, right? And everything that sort of happened with the sort of war crimes tribunal and how they sort of drummed up popular support during that sort of period, right? So before we get to their sort of second term, right, what were some of the moves that they made to sort of drum up popular support before that, and how did they sort of get such an easy win in the 2014 election, which was the sort of second one that they contested?
Well, I mean, the BNP boycotted that election.
Famously.
As I remember.
Yeah.
Right. So that was, I think that was interesting. But yeah. Did BNP boycott that election?
Exactly, yeah.
They did.
Yeah, I think BNP boycotted the election, and basically it triggered, because the Awami League basically didn't care, went ahead anyway. So, and as far as the institutions goes, I think Meg can go ahead. But since you referred to the War Crimes Tribunal, and that's the linchpin of everything that we're dealing with today, the Shahbag versus Shapla is basically the standoff that's programmed our ideological field, and we're basically stuck with that today. So for those who are not aware, Bangladesh was born in 1971 through a genocidal war, and a lot of that has never been resolved, especially the question of war criminals. And many of them were rehabilitated gradually by different regimes. And probably that came to a close in the 2001 BNP Jamaat regime, because we finally had people a lot of people very clearly knew were responsible for mass murder and mass rape and arson attacks and so on, who were now riding government vehicles with the flag of Bangladesh. And so there was a great deal of anger about that. And so when the Awami League came back into power, there's a lot of people believed, and that's something that they rode to victory on, is that it was finally time to settle this issue and take care of the war criminals. And that's what they began to do in 2013. However, that process, as far as the legality of it, as far as the minutiae of it, I'm not a legal expert, so I can't speak to that. But the verdict seems to be that they didn't really dot all their I's and cross all their T's, and so they were focused on getting it through. And things came to a stand with the Shahbag movement, which erupted because a lot of people felt that the Awami League regime was basically trying to go soft some of the Jamaat leaders and basically cut a deal behind their back, which they did before. It's not like it was not impossible. They've done that before. And that basically sparked the Shahbag uprising. And so in a way, it was sort of the last stand of the old secular nationalist middle class, which still had some kind of investment in that dream. And what that basically, it started a chain reaction because for a large portion of society, and this was not, it was not automatic because there was a lot of people who intervened, and that's something that's been forgotten today. A lot of people, I'm not going to name names now, but a lot of people intervened in producing a narrative that Shahbag was basically an atheist uprising, which it wasn't. And there was a riling up of hatred towards so-called atheist bloggers, and that triggered the Hifazat Islam, rally, Shapla, and there was a state reaction, which was incredibly violent, and it's still unclear how many people died. But that standoff basically solidified a fissure in Bangladeshi society, and the legacy of that remains today. So today, I think of it this way: when we read nationalist history is myth, and myth is about heroes, right? It's a story. And when we were growing up, we read nationalist history, we had our pick of heroes, and not everybody agreed. For some people, it was Mujib. For some people, it was Bhashani, Tajuddin, whoever it was. But there was a whole group of people in Bangladesh who never could find a hero in the nationalist myths. For them, the only people who represented them were the Razakars, the war criminals. And with Shapla, what happened was they finally had martyrs. And it sounds, it sounds very brutal the way I'm saying it, but that's in a sense what empowered an entirely different kind of politics that we're living with today. I don't know if Meg wants to add something to
that. Yeah. Meg.
Yeah. So I think I agree with almost everything that Shehzad bhai spoke about. I think it's just to add up one or two few things to it, like the politics of Ganojagaron Manch, that's colloquially called Shahbag, has sort of been the sort of theme of Bangladeshi politics. Like it has been sort of the binary division between Shapla and Shahbag. I think a lot of us who had been doing a lot of activism post 2019 were sort of very inclined to go beyond that binary and sort of establish this, sort of break this dichotomy. But even today, like you have to understand something, like when a right winger in Bangladesh calls someone a Shahbagi or calls someone from Shahbag, that doesn't essentially mean that they were for the movement in 2013 that spoke about a capital punishment for the war criminals. It essentially means anything left of center or even anything moderately right wing that the far right does not like is termed or called as Shahbagi. If you are a women's rights activist, you're a Shahbagi. If you are someone who believes that the military should not have control over the Chittagong Hill tracks and Chittagong Hill administered through civil administration, not military administration, you can be called a Shahbagi. If you are for secularism in any way, form, or shape, you can be called a Shahbagi. If you are someone who's practicing Rabindranath Thakur's songs, you can be called a Shahbagi. So I think it's very important to understand that it's a very dangerous umbrella term. But for anyone who's academically interested, I think there can be a huge sort of, like, we can have this discussion just entirely on Shahbag, and yet there would be nuances that would be missed. But I think Shehzad bhai does a great job of sort of summarizing of what happened in that kind of a situation. I think the reason why Bangladesh sort of became an oxymoron is because you had progressives and leftists sort of chanting for death penalty. Like I was a 16-year-old at that time. I just barely passed my school examination, and I was like I was a very vocal Shahbagi at that time, because like that was sort of what we understand as patriotism while we were growing up. Because like my earliest political memories are of knowing that Jamaat Islami and people who were against the whole emergence of Bangladesh are now in power. Quite interesting. A lot of those themes are coming back as sort of a repeat. Like that's not about Shahbag, but like it's like there's this quote from Karl Marx that history repeats itself, first as a tragedy and then as a comedy. We are coming to the comedy part of that kind of a thing. Everything that happened in the name of Shahbag is now happening in the name of like de you know de-Shahbagifying Bangladesh or something of that sort. Like everything is having a repeat in that kind of situation. It's horrific for people who are inside Bangladesh, but I think if someone has an academic interest in these things, I think they have a lot of fun sort of understanding these things, because it's the similarity is uncanny. Like in a lot of cases, Jamaat Islami is doing it on purpose. Like they're sort of bringing in this new Shahbag to sort of say the very same things about Awami League that used to be said about Jamaat Islami. I think something that needs to be added to this discussion is that the ICT tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal that Awami League formed, was very controversial. And there were a lot of things that were not right about the whole process. There was a lack of due process. But we are seeing the very same tools that Sheikh Hasina built are now being used to sort of criminalize Awami League in the very same way. So the law that was used to criminalize Chhatra League, the student wing of Awami League, was a law that was brought to parliament by Sheikh Hasina's party. And now the very same ICT Act that Jamaat had been railing against for 15 years is now the act that is being used to legally prosecute Awami League. So I think we are now seeing a second Shahbag, but this time it's more of a comedy than a tragedy.
I really appreciate that metaphor. It's definitely a comedy, because Shahbag was in a sense an attempt to resuscitate 71 and all the imagery of 71 and that nationalist spirit. And what we're having today is a resuscitation of that fight in order to demarcate who is a friend and who is an enemy. And another thing that Shahbag is important is something that Meg already said, was the Awami League being able to act as the savior of marginalized communities, of minorities, of women. And Shahbag really played a role in that, because what happened when you had people chanting for the death penalty for Jamaat Islami leaders, and then you had people chanting for death to the atheists, and that's the sort of bloody situation you had then. And it's not that the Awami League government protected those bloggers, by the way. They didn't. And they really played every side, and it was a glorious political move, and really worth understanding. But the crackdown on Shapla was basically the state telling the Shahbag, we are going to take care of this, right? And that was the point where I think the secular nationalism, whatever the radical potential was, because it was a radical ideology at one point in time, but secular Bengali nationalism really lost its edge and became the sort of conservative ideology that supported the Awami League regime from then on. It is not the case that everybody who were there at Shahbag wanted this. And a lot of very critical analysis of Shahbag has been produced by so-called Shahbagis. But that is, unfortunately, at the level of the structure, that's basically what happened, and we're left with the unfortunate legacy of that.
Right. Okay, so we sort of have a understanding of how national discourse in Bangladesh sort of developed a schism around 2013. Then BNP boycotted the next election, and Awami League gained even more electoral power. I sort of want to turn our attention to the period around, say, 2017 to 2018, because around that time there was an increase in contestation from various groups around the country, right? Famously, in 2018, there was student protests again, right? For the first time in Bangladesh, which basically shut down the country for a few weeks and produced, I think, one of the largest instances of Awami League's capacity for suppressing protests through violence, right? So can we talk a bit about the 2018 student protests, what sort of led to that, and maybe sort of tie it into what Shehzad talked about, how the sort of dream of developmentalism was starting to slow down by that point? And something related that happened during that time which was like the passing of the Digital Securities Act, right? Which really sort of enabled Army League to control any kind of online dissent, right? So, so to start with, right, like how did the 2018 student protests come about, right? And why? So maybe we could like start there, perhaps. Any one of you.
I think Meg would be better to start because I'm sure he can
Sure.
tell us
Right.
personal insights.
I think there are two protests that we are talking about. There was this protests about the quota on jobs, like the unfair quotas on jobs, but how students wanted a more safer roads, because there was a huge incident of a huge accident in Bangladesh, which a sitting minister sort of laughed off, like saying that there are so many accidents in India and developed countries. Like, why are we making a big deal out of it? So I think there were two protests that took place very close to each other. That's why sort of we all oftentimes, sort of conflate the two, because there was one protest in 2018 April, and then there was this other protest in August. So throughout those two protests, one thing that happened was Awami League sort of understood that the sort of population they thought were for Awami League was not actually for Awami League. So they sort of understood through this binary lens that anyone who is not an Islamist would probably support Awami League and probably still does support Awami League. And that narrative was sort of shredded through those two protests, because we saw people who were actually part of the quote-unquote Shahabag bloc sort of resisting and saying that this is not what we want from the country. And I think the jobs quota is something that is very important to understand from an socio-economical point of view, because in Bangladesh, there is a huge problem regarding how many educated, jobless people we have, so to speak. I don't know whether that's a right terminology, like educated unemployed people who have an honors degree or a master's degree and can't find a job anywhere. So I think in 2008, it was initially there was this protest against the quotas that Bangladesh had. These are very draconian sort of quota systems. I think this is also very easy, something very important to understand regarding Bangladesh and its jobs quota system. When in the West we talk about reservations, we actually understand reservations in a way to get the marginalized communities into the mainstream. That is the whole point of positive discrimination. But in Bangladesh, it was very weird. It's more of, if you want to honor someone, you give them a quota, that sort of a thing. So, like, for example, the kids and grandchildren of the freedom fighters are well respected in society, and they are it's not a socio-economic category that is marginalized. But since the government wanted to get their own people into jobs, so they can't just go out there and say there will be a 30% quota for our militants. So what they used to do was they had this quota for liberation war families, liberation war fighters families, but those quotas were essentially going to our militants, because at that point, a lot of self-respectful freedom fighters and their families stopped using their certificates altogether, because they saw what was happening in the name of freedom fighter certificates. So in 2018, the first movement that sort of shook Awami League was the quota movement, and that movement foreshadowed a lot that had happened in 2024. For example, Awami League's own cadres, a lot of cadres from Chhatra League, sort of changed or switched sides overnight during 2018 April, and that created a crisis where in residential universities, Awami League had to bring in people from other universities to make sure that the protests were physically sort of controlled and sort of demolished, and that created even more tension within those universities, and that hit a boiling. Sheikh Hasina, like on a single decision overnight, said that okay, all the quotas will be abolished, and sort of took this decision where there was the primary upheaval was sort of quelled. So, but in a lot of cases, a lot of themes that the 2018 quota protest had was actually also a foreshadowing of 2024. And then we had this protest regarding we called it Nirapod Sorok Chai. That means we want safer roads. There was this protest against, the sort of indiscriminate certification of all sorts of cars and vehicles that should not be on the road, not having proper driver licenses. But sociologically speaking, the 2018 Sorok Andolon, the road safety movement, actually created a fissure between a lot of the working class and the students, because we were essentially on each other's throats, especially those who are the workers who were on the sort of the driving cars and automobiles and things of that sort. So I think for us who are politically on the left, we had a very hard time of figuring out this movement where we should stand. As a leftist, I am for positive discrimination and bringing in marginalized people into the mainstream. But however, at the same time, the way that the quotas were being handed out was not something that any progressive would be supporting. The very same thing about the road safety movement. But I think despite a lot of nuances, those two movements sort of gave you the hint that who are the people most likely to stand up against this regime, despite all the calculations and backdoor negotiations they have made. These were people who were too young to be part of those negotiations and therefore could not be bought off, could not be controlled. One of the most interesting insights about the 2018 protests were those who were sort of beaten off the streets and beaten into their homes, put back into their homes when they were reading in class, standard 9 or standard 10, were the same people who are now reading in universities in 2024. So I think that generation who were reading in class 8, 9, 10 during the 2018 protests were in a lot of cases the leaders of the 2024 movement. So I think 2018 was sort of the dress rehearsal for 2024.
Yes, I agree. Azraf, is this better?
Perhaps a bit louder. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try. Yes, I agree with all of Meg's points. I think the quota, it is quite important to understand why it would be the movement for quota reform that would ultimately create this situation. What is the quota for? And I think in order to understand that, we also have to realize that in Bangladesh, the government job, or basically the state, and as well as the development industry, as a number one channel for class aspirations. It is and that's a legacy of the colonial state, right? The bureaucracy is built to be a class apart from ordinary people, and it's of course not the case that everybody who wants to be a civil servant wants to dominate others, but they do want that car, they do want that house, and all of that really becomes important. After 2022, we enter a period of tremendous inflation. This is triggered by energy crisis, especially the Russia-Ukraine war, and that's where I think things start to really unravel. And what you have with that period of high inflation is a lot of people benefited from the Army League rule. A lot of people at the top made a lot of money. A lot of people at the bottom as well, who could plug themselves into the patronage networks, also made money. But the people who really did not benefit or were squeezed were especially the lower middle class, the salary dependent classes. And the salary dependent classes started to really feel the squeeze, especially after 2022, because this was an economy that was expecting, it was asking them to live in a way that they simply couldn't afford. You had all of the living standards of development, but you didn't have the affordability of development. And that's when the government job really becomes important. And when you see that 30% of the government jobs are being basically allocated for people, and we also know that there is a market for certificates for freedom fighters. So everybody knows that not everybody who gets that is a genuine freedom fighter. That's a whole other black market in itself. And so that really caused things to come to a head. Another thing that I want to mention regarding 2018, and actually this goes back a few years before, another important actor comes into the scene, which is the private university students. And that really changes the game as well in 2024, because the private university student, as you know, Azraf, having been one of them, it was considered an apolitical being. But things start to change. I think it was 2015 with the No VAT movement. Things start to change. And in 2018, private university students really come out, especially after the crackdown on the protesters during the Nirapur Sorok Andolan, because the road safety movement was being led by, basically they were being led by kids, school and college students. And when there was a crackdown on them, private university students came out, and a lot of the basically battles, the street battles that happened in 2018, as Meg said, where it was a rehearsal for 2024. So that's a factor, and private university students really changed the game in 2024. But they also went back to school the day after. Their politics is different, and that's something that we have to understand. As well as the fact that most of these students grew up under basically knowing nothing but Awami League rule. So, some of us remember Awami League, BNP, Hortals, and so on. We know that there's a wider field, but for a lot of people, it's all they knew. And for some of them, for a while, it seemed like a good deal. But especially in 2018, when they were the ones getting beaten, or where their friends were getting beaten, things really started to change, and that comes back to haunt us in 2024.
Right. Okay. So now we're starting to sort of get the picture of where things ended up in 2024. I have a few questions about that, but before I ask my questions, I just wanted to remind the audience that we are willing to take questions throughout, right? So if anybody has any questions, which is probably natural given that we covered like about a decade's worth of history and flashpoints, if the audience has any questions at this juncture, we'd be happy to take them. So I'll just pause for a second to see if any questions pop up in the chat.
Why don't we take the questions at the end? Isn't that better?
In case we were speeding through real quickly.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sort of seeing anything in the chat right now. But I guess what I wanted to ask was that, and this is going to be very relevant. How did so Meg mentioned something about Awami League bringing in individuals from different universities to suppress dissent within universities. Shehzad also mentioned the crackdown on and kids literally being beaten up, right? So what were some of the sort of techniques that Awami League used to suppress dissent in these places, right? So did they use the police, the military, their own student wing, right? So for those not familiar, right, what does an Awami League crackdown look like in that period?
They developed, I think 2018 was also a laboratory in that sense, in terms of repression, because as you know, one of the main agents of their repression was the Chhatra League, the Students' League. And the Chhatra League is very crucial to the story, because I think a lot of the experiences and animosity towards the Awami League was basically produced out of public university students' experience of the Chhatra League's dominion in the public university campuses, especially the halls. So that's a huge factor that really comes into play in 2024. But basically what we see increasingly, especially in 2018, is vigilantism, in a sense, state-sponsored vigilantism, because you have these groups, we call them helmet bahini, because they used to wear helmets when they attacked. And they were the ones who would lead the charge, and the police would sort of help them, or they would stand by, but they were the ones leading the charge. And so you have a situation where you can potentially, because it's not law enforcement, it's not the state apparatus, right? It's people theoretically who are defending their party, or theoretically defending their idea of the nation. And that's a new thing. Another thing that happens is the Digital Security Act, which is there's a precursor to that. There's the ICT Act, which was already in place, and then the Digital Security Act is a new version that happens after the Naya Pachor Andolan. And the Digital Security Act, as far as I can tell, that's there's a narrative that sees the DSA as a very simplistic instrument of censorship, but I think the DSA was much more complex. It was like a stick that the Awami League basically handed out to anyone and said, if I'm giving you this stick, you don't like this, what this person is saying online about you. And that could be about religion, it could be about the nation, it could be about politics. So you use my stick to beat up this person, I'll take care of it. And that's another way that they were basically monopolizing the space. So these are some of the new technologies of repression that they were developing. I think Meg will have more to share about this.
So I think Shehzad Bhai makes it a lot easier by saying out a lot of things that I would have had to said if he did not go first. I think what I can add and sort of bring back from the last point Shehzad Bhai also mentioned is like there are three very important things. Firstly, the reason why 2018 was not a really successful and 2024 was successful, I think there are two very important reasons for it. Number one is like Chhatra League was a very important tool in Awami League's disposal. Why is it so? Like politics in a lot of cases is about optics. So when Chhatra League beats up a student, like for example, I've been beaten up like 5 or 7 times in my last 6 or 7 years of activism and politics, like that did not have that kind of a ring to it, or they did not sound as visceral as it would have if the police was used to sort of beat me up. So when a Chhatra League guy is beating up a left winger in campus or a right winger in campus, it's seen as, oh, students be squabbling amongst themselves or something like an internal dispute of students. So it is very easy to sort of not take that into account or sort of not deal with that. The moment Chhatra League decides not to take part in the sort of beating of other students, it becomes a problem for Awami League. It became a problem for Awami League in 2018's April movement, when it was about job quotas, and they sort of had to resort to conceding to the demands at that point. And in 2024, even though they conceded to their demands, the harm was already done. The fact that there were students were being beaten up by mercenaries from all around the country, being taken into the Dhaka University in trucks and buses and things of that sort, that had a visceral impact. So I think one of the most important toolboxes in Awami League's repertoire was Chhatra League, and the reason why 2024 was a success was in a huge way because Awami Chhatra League at one point did not want to participate in what was going on. A lot of the Chhatra League cadres sort of rebelled, and that created a problem for Awami League because now they had to bring in the police, now they had to bring in the army because they did not have student goons for them anymore. Another thing that is very important about 2018 and the difference between 2018 and 2024, something that Shehzad Bhai pointed out, was about how the class aspiration of a lot of people sort of diminished through after 2022. While inflation and the Russia-Ukraine war was a huge factor in that, I think another thing that has to be said is about how Awami League handled the COVID situation. Because during the COVID situation, Bangladesh got a loan from IMF that had all sort of, IMF stipulations added to it. And it essentially, a lot of the sort of welfare schemes that Awami League used to have, a lot of them were cut off. And, according to Awami League's very own, the government's very own data, almost 20 million people, like that would be 2 crore people, went back into poverty during COVID. And that created a huge problem because in 2018, when the students came down and were beaten up, the workers did not sort of rally around them. Because for the workers, Awami League was still a better deal, even in 2018, because in a lot of cases, they were sort of seeing their life standards slowly getting better, like nothing of substance,
but a very gradual change in lifestyles and a very gradual upwards mobilization. And after 2021, that changed drastically. So before 2021, a lot of our movements were regarding civil liberties and rights and press freedom and a lot of those stuff. And while a section of the middle class was interested in those kind of issues, we never saw a huge influx of working class people in those issues. But after 2021, what happened was the economic factor also became a huge issue, because a lot of the welfare schemes were gone, a lot of people went back into poverty, and there was no state recognition of it. So when in 2017 or 18, when a minister used to say, you know what, we are developing the life standards of Bangladeshis, that rang a bell, or that resonated with a certain section of the population, which were lower class. But after 2021, that was just a plain-faced lie. So my personal experience is 2024 would have never been successful if hordes of working class people, be it rickshaw pullers and RMG sector workers, and even like the petty bourgeois section of the population, like hawkers and vendors and small business owners, if they support the movement the way they did. So while it was triggered from a jobs quota of people who had huge class aspirations and wanted to become quote unquote public servants, it also had repercussions regarding how the greater society saw their economic prospects. And since the diminishing of those economic prospects, that sort of became a big trigger for a lot of people to come in and join the movement. While those things were not, spoken out loudly, but that were sort of the aspirations that a lot of working class people had. And obviously, in what happens in post-colonial countries, like none of those aspirations have been met, and you can even argue a lot of things have become worse for a lot of working class people. But that was sort of the sort of aspiration. And in regards to DSA, I think a lot of critics, especially those who were critiquing how the financial sector was being handled, how banks were being looted, were targeted through this. Now, what's very interesting about the Digital Security Act and the acts that preceded and succeeded is that, so for example, if Azraf says something bad about me, like if I don't mind about it, like I don't have to know about the fact that Azraf has said something bad to me. Shehzad Bhai can just on behalf of me, just register a case against Azraf without me even knowing it. So that sort of meant is it sort of create a micro-fascism. Like you had people who were not part of the government, but who still had the legal right to morally police you. And that is a very interesting dynamic, because that created people who were even more enthusiastic than the Army League leaders themselves. For example, a lot of Army League leaders couldn't mind some protesting them or someone sort of saying something about them, like they would tolerate it. But there were Chhatrali goons who were so desperate to establish the fact that they love their party and their leaders so much that they'd go out of their way to sort of police another person. And that created a society of mass moral policing and mass speech policing, something which is repercussion we are still dealing with even today. I think that is the sort of legacy of DSA. And even the new government has been very bad in those regards. They've also jailed people for their speeches. So yeah, like that was all I had to say about that.
Right. Okay. So I think so far we've got, and funny enough, we've like sort of covered a couple of the questions that I was going to ask in the interim, right? So we have an idea of how we got to the protests of July 2024, what was different about them, because there has been a lot written about, a lot published about the actual events of July 2024. I guess us as panelists, we discussed ahead of time that perhaps it's better not to go with a blow-by-blow play of that. So what we know is that last year, the Supreme Court overturned the decision to abolish the quota movement. And as a result, folks took the streets again. And there were a few things that were distinctly sort of different about it. As Meg alluded to, this time it was a movement which saw participation from all sections of the working class, right? But I guess I had a question specifically on that for Meg, right? In a lot of international reporting on the events of July 2024, it's always sort of painted as a student-led movement, right? And you've already said that, like, it wouldn't have been possible without the participation of the sort of working class, right? Just for clarity's sake, you can give a short response, right? Like, what was the sort of structure of this? Like, how was it like structurally like student led, right? Just as a short response, or if you have anything to say on that.
So I think there's two part of this movement. One is a movement before 15th July, and then there's this movement after 15th July. Because still 15th July, it was all about quotas and jobs, and even it's very that leftists were sort of shunned out from the leadership roles before 15th July because we were too anti-government. So the fear was that we will use rhetoric to sort of stir up the masses into a frenzy against the government, and that would eventually make sure that the quota reform doesn't go through. But the moment the government sort of used Awami League to hit back the students on 15th July, made sure that it did not remain about quotas anymore. All the 16 years of oppression sort of, culminated in this sort of consolidated hatred for this regime. And that was sort of, that did not really come through from anyone's, no one really cared who was leading the movement at that point, honestly. Like after 18th July, the quote unquote leaders of the movement were hiding. Like none of them were sort of found on the streets or on places where people were organizing. So a lot of grassroots organizing took place because of what time it was. Students did have a role in as so far as that till 18th July. For example, Dhaka University students were prominent figures in the movement till 16th July. After that, after the university was vacated, there was not a lot of participation from Dhaka University students. If someone says Dhaka University students did a lot after that, they were just simply lying. Like after 16th to 17th July, what happened was the private university students sort of took over the mantle, because in 18th July and 19th July, we saw huge influx of private university students being in the forefront of the movement. But when they were also being beaten and killed and butchered, you saw an influx of unnamed people who do not have names, people who are not registered, people who are never coordinators, people who are not quote unquote stakeholders of the movement, but people who bled the most, people who gave their lives in the largest of numbers. And these workers, these RMG sector workers, these rickshaw pullers, these, auto van drivers, these hawkers, they did not come there because someone called them. They did not read Facebook posts and go there. They heard and saw what was happening. And that sort of created one of those beautiful moments when sort of people, come together on a common cause. And in this time, like by the time students were being killed and kids were being killed, I think that was a moral red line for a lot of people. People did not come to the streets because they knew Nahid or Mahfouz or Asif or any of them. People came to this because they knew they were being killed. I think that sort of crossed the line that, okay, we understand that you're not going to give us freedom of speech. We have accepted that. We have also accepted the fact that you're not going to give us a guarantee of livelihood. We have also accepted that. But if you are killing our children, like then there can be no negotiation with you. Like you have to go. One of the most famous lines of the movement or of the uprising was "Chakri dibi na dibi, amar beta ke marlu ken," which roughly translates into, if you don't want to give my son a job, don't give my son a job. But why did you have to kill him? Like that was sort of the spirit or the understanding that brought people together. After 17th or 18th July, this movement had no central planning. This movement had no central structure. It was a grassroots organizing model, and where credit has to be given to the organizers themselves was that they made sure that there was no singular leader who can be captured and the movement be dismantled. Like even when the quote unquote shamannoyaks, the organizers or coordinators were in jail or in custody of the government, the movement still went on. Nothing really was being hampered. Like if you sort of arrested one group, another group would sort of start doing something. Like it all culminated in the 2nd of August when they thought like, okay, now we've got everyone in size, like everyone has been back to size, everyone is in jail or in hiding or things of that. Like somehow leftist organizations go together and sort of build this huge, mass protest, and like which is very surprising given how little influence we have on the field. But again, like no one was looking who's the leader, no one was looking who are we standing beside. What was paramount was to get rid of Hasina. Everyone did what they had to do in order to get rid of Hasina and Awami League. And that's how the movement sort of becomes successful. Anyone else who says that there was this masterful plan and mastery, there are masterminds this movement, are BSing it, because there was no grand plan. The people who took up the responsibility of getting rid of a tyrant, and that is what people did. Unfortunately, they went back home the next day, but that's that.
Right. Okay. So we all know what happened next, right? The Awami League regime is toppled. Sheikh Hasina flees to destinations unknown or known. So what I want to ask about, I guess, and I think is the most interesting part of the discussion, is what has sort of been the political reality in Bangladesh afterwards, right? And here, feel free to take it in any sort of direction, right? So we know that there's an interim government figureheaded by Muhammad Yunus, who was the Nobel Prize winner, I think, back in 2006. They've promised reforms. What's been going on in the ground with regard to, let's say, law and order, how minorities are treated, etc.? Feel free to take this in any direction.
I think Azad Bhai should go first. I'll just later.
Okay. I think we can start with something that Meg actually said about the movement, especially after 18th. Hi. Is this better? We can start. One of the things that comes to haunt us after the fall of Hasina actually is foreshadowed in the fact that after July 18th and especially 19th, after the curfew starts, and we basically have an insurgency situation. And we can also see, we can prove Meg's point actually by tracing the geography of the protests during the time, because it's precisely in some of the peripheral areas of the city and the working class areas that we find the most fighting. So that shows us how the movement had actually shifted by then. But the point that I'm taking from Meg is that people were basically coming out because they wanted that regime to go and not because they were fighting for a leader. And that's something that's different compared to every other instance in many cases, especially with 71 was a mass war. It was a people's war. But even a few years before that, many people were calling, especially when Mujib was imprisoned, people were declaring Sheikh Mujib as some kind of de facto leader of the nation. So there was some aspiration about leadership, and people were looking to leaders. And this was not the case in July. Now, the fact is that when Hasina is toppled, and I think Meg as well was probably on the ground on August 5th, it was quite something. I did not see a lot, there was enormous amounts of people. And what I saw the most was basically Dhaner Shish, right, which is the symbol of BNP. And that's a clue as to the fact that all kinds of people of all kinds of ideological persuasions had become involved in this, and they were doing this for their own reasons, and they were trying to get rid of this regime. And every attempt to claim that the spirit of July since then has basically run into this problem, right? So there was no hegemony built before the thing actually happened, before Hasina fell. Some people had some vague ideas about some of the student coordinators, but that's about it. And people had sympathy for them. But not everybody looked at them as leaders. And this all starts to unravel after August. So you have at the moment an explosive political situation where the a tremendous political vacuum, which is trying to people are trying to fill it in all kinds of ways. The main opposition to the Army League, the BNP, aspires to power whenever the election happens, and the new kind of politics of the student coordinators, be it in the form of the NCP, be it in other forms, they are now, in a sense, getting trapped in this field because with having to compete with the BNP, and for a variety of reasons that I think Meg would be better placed to explain, variety of reasons alienating the left and continuing to alienate the left, they basically had no choice but to turn to the right. And that's when groups like Jamaat Islami and Hifazat Islam come in. Now, it is a fact that a lot of the sharpest critique of the Awami League regime, at the vanguard of that critique, was also coming from these places, from groups like Islami Chhatra Shibir, it's a student wing of the Jamaat Islami. The critique of the Awami League regime as Islamophobic, that's something that develops in some of these circles. So we have to understand the relationships among all of these people who come together under this particular moment. And some of them are trying to articulate a vision that is more inclusive than others. But unfortunately, many of the leaders of this new political platform are being pushed, or at least are actually sensing an opportunity in the right, and have turned to really gross populist, mobilizations and taking stances that are, that's part of the reason why we had the Women's Solidarity Rally today, is because of the positions that people are taking. So that's an explosive political fabric, and things are not great. We had an assassination a few days ago of a young BNP activist. We had, people hurling stuff at Mahfouz, who's one of the faces of the new political sort of constellation. And there's clearly a whole lot of competition on the ground, not only in terms of influence, but in terms of the basics of politics, which is your finance, and plugging yourself into the clientelist networks. And there's a whole lot of competition in the ideological field as well. So that's where I am seeing it go. I think Meg can add to that.
Meg, are you there?
Yeah, am I audible and visible again?
Yes, you are.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So I think things like a lot of people might have a rosy-eyed view of this mass uprising, because I understand these things happening in a lot of times when you're sort of seeing it from abroad, and a particular narrative is being pushed, and this is something that is very important. I think a lot of you critical thinkers must be very careful about is how the regime of Dr. Mahmoud Yunus will be portrayed in the West, because you have to understand that their alliances go far beyond this dichotomy of Awami League BNP. Dr. Mahmoud Yunus has been pitched as the leader of Bangladesh for a very long time. US liberals and a lot of, I casually call them, imperialistic liberals, have oftentimes been a very sort of huge supporter of Dr. Mahmoud Yunus and all the policies that he has wanted to get through. I think the problem on the ground has been, for the last 30 years, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992, the left in Bangladesh has been very disoriented. Like, a lot of us have a certain amount of, personal cachet, if you would like to call it that. Like, okay, there are leaders from the left who are sort of treated as important figures and things of that sort, but collectively the left has lost a lot of influence for a lot of reason. And that has the left and the right, because of the political structure, have never been part of the power groups in parliament. But what they have done is, the societal fight has always been between the left and the right, and the centrist political parties like Awami League and BNP has sort of gravitated towards where the political power or political agenda lies. For example, even in the case of giving punishment to the war criminals, that has not been that used to be a left-wing project more than it was an Awami League project. Awami League only gave into that project in 2008 when they saw there was this huge young population who were growing up in the blogosphere days, where there's a lot being written in blogs, and they sort of saw that this is a very good way to sort of get those young voters into their fold. But after 5th of August, what has happened is all the rhetoric of inclusive politics and going beyond Shapla Shahabag has been turned on its head. It has been pretty hellish for anyone who's on the left of center of the political spectrum in any way, shape, or form, be it in terms of indigenous rights, be it in terms of religious minorities' rights, be it in terms of women's rights. And those things are sort of being shunned away from the political discussion when anyone who says anything is being tagged as an Awami League sympathizer. I myself has been called an army sympathizer for at least 6-7 months now, and a sympathizer of India and things of that nature. Now these conversations are sort of dragged through social media, and the right wing has a huge ecosystem that can turn anything upside down. So in what the new political group who are calling themselves centrist are anything but centrist. What they are doing is they're trying to placate the left and the right at the same time, which is essentially creating even more tension. For example, one of their people would go to those rallies held by the Hefazote-Islam, where they are talking about talking against the proposed reforms that the Commission of Women's Rights that the government has assigned is proposing. And at the same time, they will also send people to the Women's March and say, we are also we also support the women's rights, and we are a part of this fight. So I think this is essentially creating a huge problem in society, because now you don't know who's fighting for whom and whom you can trust and whom you can't trust. And that's creating a lot of social tension. I think also a very important thing is, like, there is this narrative and this myth that right-wingers had been very vocal about what Awami League had been doing and what Awami League had been sort of saying. That's not essentially true, because in a lot of cases, we've seen the biggest religious clerics in Bangladesh sort of towing the line of Awami League and saying, how Sheikh Hasina is the custodian of Islam in Bangladesh, and a lot of those things. Now, not surprisingly, very unsurprisingly, after 5th of August, they have become the biggest vocals against Awami League and Sheikh Hasina. And they've almost sort of, rewritten history in a way that says that, they were the ones who were being tortured, and they were the ones who were being sort of harassed and bullied and all of those stuffs. So what has happened is, like, now anyone on the left of center is not allowed to talk as much, or if they do, there is a whole online bashing army. There is the state apparatus. They would go on and do anything. Like, it's very interesting. Like, my case is a very interesting anecdotal example of what has been happening, because I've been sort of comrades to a lot of those student protesters or student advisors who have been part of those movements. Like, we've marched together, we've had common programs together. But I myself you're basically talking to what do you call it? I'm not a convict yet. What do you call Obhijukta? What's the right term for Obhijukta in English? What call it? Like, there's a case going on against me right now of harassing or harassing the police. And that case came about because we had a protest against rape and all sorts of gender-based discriminations. That protest was going to the residence of the chief advisor, and we were sort of barricaded in front of Intercontinental Hotel, a very prominent place in Bangladesh. And it was the police who started harassing us. But as it always happens, you people are more than familiar with it. They went on and labeled charges against us. And that is not an isolated issue. There has been, brutalization of the workers' movements all around the country. Workers' movements are also being portrayed as a gateway for Awami League coming back. Minority rights movement have been portrayed as a gate for Awami League of Awami League coming back. So what has essentially happened is there is this far right agenda that is being pushed through in the cloak of radical centrism or neither left nor right, while we who are on the ground very much understand this is very much right wing. And I think it's very important for like it in Donald Trump's USA, I think you understand what it's like. When I mean right wing, I don't mean fiscal conservative policies. I don't mean we have a philosophical argument about whether the market should run the things or the government should run the things. It's not that sort of a right wing. It's the sort of right wing that says that women and men should not be allowed in the same workplaces. Hefazote-Islam is like the definition of fascism, and yet somehow through the very complex history of Bangladesh, we are at a point in Bangladesh where Hefazote-Islam is being seen as the primary anti-fascists of Bangladesh, which is like very weird. Like Islamofascism is still fascism. And a lot of things they say, for example, the government, the state has to declare Qadianis, who are an offshoot of offshoot Muslim group. They have to declare Qadianis of non-Muslims. That is one of their primary demands. Their demands are also that like marital rape does not be recognized as rape. Their demands are also that the proposed women's rights bill, the proposed reforms do not go through. And one of the most key reforms is that they want to recognize sex workers as workers, and that is something that the right wing cannot really deal with. And there are questions regarding indigenous issues. There is historically Hindus have been part of the Awami League coalition, but there has been indiscriminate attacks against Hindu minorities throughout the last 9 months. A lot of them were not part of the Awami League regime. And these things are not being taken seriously by the government. And these things are not getting a lot of political traction, because the moment you say anything of that sort, you get instantly be labeled as Awami League. So any liberal Democrat right now in Bangladesh, any secularist right now in Bangladesh, irrespective of what position they had during July or even before July, is under the cosh. And if we do not deal things properly right now, we are looking towards Bangladesh slowly turning into a theocracy. Because I think another important fact that has to be sort of spoken about is that while there's a lot of obsession about India, the issue of India in Bangladesh is a lot like the issue of Israel in the West. Because at one hand, you have to sort of talk about what India is doing, because their expansionist idea of controlling the South Asian region is something that any sort of progressive or any sort of person who has their politics based on human rights will have to oppose. But at the same time, a lot of the anti-India narrative is simply anti-Hindu narrative. Like, for example, the national anthem of Bangladesh is written by Rabindranath Tagore, a prominent Brahmo figure, what's a bit distinct for our League, but you don't really expect fascists and right-wingers to like consider all that. But like even singing the national anthem written by Rabindranath Tagore is somehow being called Indian expansionism and Indian cultural hegemony, which is basically code word for Hindu. Like in the right-wing politics of Bangladesh, it's of like this is a very interesting trick that a lot of anti-Semites play. Like when you can't really say Jews in polite society, so they just say Zionists. Like in the very same way, they won't say Hindu, they'll say Indian expansionists or something of that sort. And why this is very important to understand is like there is no way of going away from the Indian question, because India is an expansionist force in South Asia, and that's something that is like something that is really harming Bangladesh for a very long time. But what is interesting is the government hasn't really done a lot about the material things or the material aspects of that issue. For example, there is this power plant called Rampal Bidyut Kendra in the Sundarbans in Bangladesh, which is basically the biggest mangrove in the world. What is interesting is the company which has led this project is NTPC, an Indian company which did a nationalized Indian company, which couldn't do this project on their own land because their Supreme Court didn't allow them to do it. Now, in the last 9 months, this interim has said nothing about Rampal. The interim has done nothing about bringing electricity from Adani. In fact, it has renewed its contract with Adani and sort of made sure that Adani keeps on supplying electricity to Bangladesh. But at the same time, anyone who has been culturally sort of liberalish or someone who talks a lot about Hindu-Muslim unity and things of that sort are instantly labeled as India sympathizers. And that has made politics even more problematic. For example, right now, as we speak, in the CHT border, the border close to Myanmar, there is a humanitarian corridor that is being sort of pushed through under the veil, and there has been no public discussion regarding it. Do the majority support a humanitarian corridor in the CHT? I don't think so. I don't think so they will if enough things are being said about it. But it is a very important and crucial sort of political agenda that the Dr. Mohammed Yunus regime is pulling through, because it's connected with the US, it's connected with UN, and there is a huge possibility that will sort of take us down the line for a war with Myanmar, which is like very possible if this goes through. But the reason why they have to do it is because there is no alternative politics. It is simply changing the people or changing the countries. You used to serve Delhi, now supposed to serve Washington. Nothing has significantly changed. But throughout all that, what has happened is, again, a group of people are not being heard, and what they're saying is instantly being labeled as unpatriotic or something that is being done to the Indian agenda. If you want to talk about it, I think we can talk about the humanitarian corridor more if we get a chance later.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot there. I guess what I want to bring back in is an audience question that we received in the interim, right? Isaac asked, considering like the many fault lines in Bangladesh politics starting from pre-71 to 2024, is there any way of settling the issues of the Bihari massacres pre and post 71 and the ongoing ethnocide in the Chittagong Hill Tracts? The former has been a rallying cry for Jamaat and other parties in the religious right who want to dismiss the actions of the Pakistani army. Like with regards to that, right? I want to sort of ask you guys, as sort of primer for the audience, what has been going on in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, not only in the last sort of year, but like more broadly, and how the current interim government's actions sort of play in that. Meg, do you want to keep on going, or Shehzad, do you want to take a stab at this?
I think Shehzad should go first. I'll just come in later.
Sure.
Yeah. So the Chittagong Hill Tracts are Palestine, right? It's a settled colonial area. It is a home to indigenous peoples who are not Bengali and who are primarily not Muslim. It is an artifact of partition that they became a part of Bangladesh, as it happened in so many ways. And ever since partition and after 71, it's been an issue. The first issue, of course, was a question of national identity. It is, after all, Bangladesh, and it was imagined as a nation state for the Bengalis, for the East Bengalis. And this becomes a problem because of the fact that we actually have a lot of non-Bengalis in this part of the world. That includes both the indigenous people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. That also includes Biharis, which is also an umbrella term. They are not all from Bihar. And that is a product of the fact that we have been part of so many projects of state building, going back to the British colonial state. And people have been moving around in this part of the world for a very long time, and people have been settling here for a very long time. And part of the problem that we have in Bangladesh, and this relates to this question of the fault lines, is that we can't really square the fact that we were both East Pakistan and we are also Bangladesh, and the fact that we wanted both. Because in nationalist narratives of Bangladesh, East Pakistan almost appears as a mistake, even though the fact that the movement for Pakistan began here, it was something that people aspired to. So how can we aspire to a land for the Muslims of South Asia and then in a span of 20 odd years, basically wage war against that idea? And that is the legacy that we are dealing with. Now, A lot of people moved to East Pakistan after partition because it was Pakistan, and they came for Pakistan, and then suddenly Pakistan was no longer Pakistan; it was Bangladesh, and that trapped a lot of people who we are calling Biharis. Many of them, uh, most of them, I would say, simply basically, they were the same, and the state and the nation changed. Many of them fought for their version of Pakistan, just like Bengalis fought for Bangladesh, and the legacy of that continues. There, solutions to that problem, the problem of Biharis, the problem of Chittagong Hill Tracts, are not, it's still not on the horizon. Regarding the Chittagong Hill Tracts, it's been militarized for decades. The army basically controls that entire area. There's a great deal of interest in terms of basically turning it into it's already an extraction economy, turning into rubber plantations, tourism. The army plays a big role there. And it's an interesting thing because so-called anti-71 ideologues bring up the massacre of Biharis, which is real, as well as the issue of Chittagong Hill Tracts, which is real. So after Hasina's fall, there was, some people raised the issue that we should not have, we should change the national anthem, right? And that's because the national anthem is Amar Shona Bangla, and the justification that many right wings were saying is that we are not all Bengalis. But it's the same people who will claim that the Chittagong Hill Tracts is rightfully land for Bengali Muslims. Because since the 80s, there's been a state and army-backed, basically, settlement program, taking landless Bengali peasants, primarily Muslim peasants, and settling in the hill tracts. And over the years, this has basically changed demographics completely. And so this is basically the situation there. There's been separatist movements in the Chittagong Hill Tracts for a long time. There was a peace accord in the 90s. Most of that accord was not respected by the state. So we have that explosive situation still. And that explosive situation also came to a head after the fall of Hasina, because many of indigenous communities supported the movement and they were part of the movement. And then suddenly they found that actually they were not meant to be part of the new Bangladesh after all. And one of the first attacks in the new Bangladesh came on Adivashi students who were protesting this. So that's the Chittagong Hill Tracts in brief, I guess.
So yeah, should I jump in?
Feel free, please.
Yeah, so I think this is very helpful for me because Shehzad bhai is talking about complicated things in the beginning, so I don't have to sort of waste my time on nuances, and I can go on ranting, something that I like doing. So I think one of the things that everyone has to understand, oftentimes talk about Biharis, the only time they talk about Biharis is when they want to whitewash the genocide that had been committed by the Pakistani military during 1971, and it is sort of the whataboutism they used to sort of justify that. But in terms of making Biharis full-time citizens and sort of giving them all the rights that a Bangladeshi would get, there's also an important class question or class aspect to it. A lot of Biharis who are already mainstreamed in Bangladesh, and they have sort of gotten their certificates, they have made sure they're citizens of Bangladesh. Oftentimes they do not even talk about the fact that their ethnicity is Bihari. Who have been hurt most by this sort of jingoistic nationalism is those Biharis who are on the bottom of the socio-economic ladder, and these are the people who are used for crimes, for political crimes. They are the ones who are used to peddle drugs, and it is important for the capitalist system that Bangladesh has to keep them in that way, to ensure that they are never really taken care of. Because if they're citizens with equal rights, they do not really have the issue of sort of going into drug peddling or different kinds of petty crimes in order to ensure their livelihood. So it is important, almost essential, for the political class of Bangladesh to keep them as they are and trying to ensure that they do not get citizens' rights, because then they will not be tools that they can use to do crimes and other things that us good Bengalis will not do, or things of that nature. And in terms of the issue of CHT, I think that has been a very huge burning issue in Bangladesh for the last 54 years, both because of its geopolitical, importance of where those people live. If you sort of look at the Bangladesh map, you will see that there is this, southeast coast of Bangladesh, that is all the hilly region, and that part is also the place where all the indigenous people live. And in that place, you'll have the military occupation that has been going on from like 1975. You have a settler program that has basically been an ethnic cleansing to a point where Bengalis are now the majority in those three districts as well. And since it is very interesting that those who say that we are not Bengalis or the Bengali nationalism is based merely on Indian construction are the very same people who become rabid Bengalis the moment someone speaks about indigenous rights. So again, there are a lot of people who are sort of playing both sides to that argument. In terms of constructive understanding, Bangladesh has never been a pluralistic nation. Bangladesh has always been, going from one homogeneous identity to another. In 1947, we built a country because we thought that upper caste Hindus will not give us enough rights. But at the same time, when we sort of only focused on our Muslim identity, what happened was a huge portion of the population was not Muslims. And even though the Bangladeshis and Pakistanis were both Muslims, the culture and the socioeconomics and the geography, nothing was the same. So therefore, that did not survive. And what replaced it was a Bengali nationalism, which was also homogeneous. Therefore, we never dealt with the question of how to build a society with plural identities, how to build a society where plural identities can all have equal status and equal rights. And that is something that we go back to now and again. It is interesting that one of the most important figures in the in the indigenous rights movement, Kalpana Chakma, who was abducted in 1992 and never heard back from again. Kalpana Chakma became a part of the collective consciousness of people during the July days, when the army tanks were sitting just beside our homes and our offices and our schools. And at that moment, Kalpana Chakma's dire warning that everything that is being done in the hills today will come down to the plainlands tomorrow. And that suddenly became, Bengalis suddenly understood what the plight of the indigenous people in CHT is. But after 5th of August went away, suddenly the military became best friends of the civilian Bengali population again, and the CHT people became Indian puppets and things of that nature. And so I don't think anyone in the political class right now has half the guts to do what is necessary to be done in those kind of situations, because it is a sort of a jingoistic nationalism that uses one content or one character today and uses another character tomorrow. But essentially, it's very homogeneous. It has very little room for pluralism. And anytime you see anyone from the government or the interim regime or the student advisor saying anything about plurality, know that they are BSing you, because they have actually no interest in pluralism. If they had any interest in pluralism, or every single political argument would not start with the lines that in a country of 90% Muslims, fill in the blanks with whatever fascistic thing you want to do this week. Just start the sentence, in a country with 90% Muslims. And then they will have this kind of a sort of a fascistic thing that they want to say after that. So I think the condition for pluralism in Bangladesh is dire. Therefore, the issue of equal rights, either for Biharis or for Adivashis, the indigenous people, is something that is going to be a fight for a very long time. I don't see it being resolved anytime soon.
Right. Okay. Just that there's a lot to unpack here, but being mindful of time, I'm just going to ask one final question to our panelists before we open up to the audience, right? So one thing that's come up again and again is this sort of slide to the right of the figures in the interim government. And what was mentioned earlier was that during the month of July and August, there was acts of local community defense by the working class and in local neighborhoods, right? But what sadly happened was that they went home after the fact, right? So I guess I'm gonna ask like a three-part question. One, why do you guys think that the events of last year did not lead to more sort of political consciousness and a recognition that people need to be more involved? Two, if the working class and a lot of these individuals went back home, who had the sort of ground game organized power, right? Probably the Hafajat Islam, right? So like how does this play into the sort of promises of electoral reform, right? That the interim government has made, right? And how do you see those going? And lastly, we were supposed to talk about this, but I don't know if you'll have time. What about the kinds of economic reform that these people have promised? Like, has that also been compromised by their slide to the right? So I know that's a lot to ask, but I just also want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. So whatever you guys have to say on that.
Well, I can speak about the economic reforms a little bit, I guess, and which have been nil or worse. In a sense, the interim government is basically keeping the Awami League's development model alive. The one thing that they have done, and the one thing that we should give them credit for, is they were basically able to avert a full-scale financial collapse, and they were able to stabilize the banks. That's something that we should definitely give them credit for. But beyond that, there has been no attempt at any serious economic reform. Whether it's a question of workers' rights, it's been curtailed as brutally as at any other time. The only difference is because these guys have not consolidated the power enough, compared to the Army League, they are not being able to do the kinds of things that the Army League does. But in terms of workers' rights, right now there's a wave of demolitions happening where battery run rickshaws and street vendors are basically being picked up, rickshaws are being destroyed, and the shops are being destroyed. And the whole thing is being applauded by the middle class because that's what they do. But the fact is that these are lifelines for an economy of incredible joblessness at the moment. Um, every single large scale mega project, the stuff that we complained during the movement and before the fall, all of them are ongoing. Many of them are being aggressively pursued. The only thing that they have done is basically once in a while, they basically say, we are cutting down on costs on this project, right? In fact, they reported that they cut down costs on the Podda Bridge project 2 months after the Podda Bridge part was already completed. So I don't really know how that happened. But beyond that, and this is very interesting because there's nothing that the middle class loves more than talk about cost cutting. That's the one thing that people have an issue with when it comes to these mega projects, is how long they take and how much they cost. Nobody worries about, for example, how much workers are paid for any of these projects. Nobody is that concerned about the environmental impacts. One of the fights that is ongoing right now is in Pantukunju Park, where some protesters have been occupying the park because even after the fall, people are basically trying to push through an extension of the Dhaka Expressway project, which would basically mean completely destroying hundreds and hundreds of trees. And you know how little of that we have left in Dhaka. And so every single thing, and probably the grossest aspect of this was the BIDA conference investment summit that happened a few months ago or a month ago. I don't remember. It was extremely flashy. It was basically Bangladesh putting up a flashy presentation and begging for money. None of that money has happened yet. But what we have promised basically, and what Dr. Yunus unfortunately is doing, is going from country to country and promising them economic zones. It's almost like Oprah. Everybody's getting an economic zone. I don't know how we're going to fit that many economic zones in Bangladesh. The Awami League regime had plans for 100 economic zones, and they've strapped it down to 5. But these economic zones are not, we don't have just free land lying around to turn into an economic zone. This means deep dispossession. This means deforestation. This means cutting down hills, which is already happening. So as far as the development model goes, we have not moved 1 inch from the Awami League, aside from basically stabilizing the banks. Yeah, I think Meg can talk about the other reforms or the other questions that you had. I forgot. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I had a question about electoral reform and how it sort of ties into who has power on the ground right now. And where do you guys see that going?
Well, there is a lot of talk about constitutional reform and electoral reform. Constitutional reform, most of the talk, unfortunately, I would say is misdirected and a waste of time. There's a lot of talk about what should be the basic principles of Bangladesh, and you're replacing secularism with pluralism. I don't know what that shift means. There are people spending time on what should be the correct translation of the name of the country. So that's a lot of stuff that's happening regarding electoral reform. That's not really my area, but what the main debate is whether we should continue with the first past the post system or we should go with a proportional system, as Meg was talking about. A proportional system is good for all of these other parties that otherwise are not really able to secure any seats in parliament. And of course, the largest party in the scene right now, BNP, is not in favor of that because that means that they're going to win less seats. I don't have strong opinions about that either way. There's talk about having two houses of parliament in the upper and lower. All of that is going on. I'm not saying that these are not important, but I am in a sense saying that these are not important because they are going to be the minutia. Whereas we are really dealing with much bigger fights right now. Fights about basic questions of who belongs to the nation and who has claims over the nation. And in that regard, the Women's Reform Commission is a prime example. The Women's Reform Commission is a government-appointed body, like many of the reform commissions that the interim government has put up. Interestingly, the caretaker government in the transition from Ershad's regime to electoral democracy also had these commissions. They also produced all of these reports, and then nobody read them after, and nobody did anything about them. So but I think these Reform Commission reports are extremely valuable because they're a window into what Bangladesh is like right now. So the Labor Reform Commission report gives us a lot of insight and a lot of data about what's happening with workers, especially in the garments industry. Similarly with the Women's Reform Commission. Now, the fight, of course, is that enormous backlash over the Women's Reform Commission, especially over the proposition that we should have equal property rights, which is something that women's organizations have been fighting for decades. And of course, the primary opposition is coming from groups like Hifaz Islam, which has the audacity to go on stage and call them whores. Excuse my language, but that's basically what they said. Now, we have to appreciate the significance of this when people, and they shared the stage with many of the new political faces as well, can go on stage in Bangladesh and call a government appointed body a group of whores. That's something. That's a signal. And it's a very dangerous signal. And I don't think enough people are seeing how significant that is. So I think these Reform Commission reports are extremely valuable. I think some of the arguments are frankly, not very important, but the fight is happening elsewhere. At least that's what I think.
Meg, anything to add before we turn to audience questions?
Yeah, so I think a few things to add. One of the key questions here is about the economic reforms that the government is taking. Essentially, this government's economic plans are not really that different from the previous one, so to speak. It's about how you can sell the cheap labor of Bangladesh and how you can entice foreign investors into investing in Bangladesh, sort of giving them this kind of thing that they can't really refuse, or something that, foreign investors cannot get enough of, cheap labor. And I think this is something that is very important to understand in terms of Bangladesh. For example, a lot of the economic progress that Bangladesh has made is due to two groups. One is the RMT sector, the ready-made garment sector workers. Something that is like the ready-made garment sector is something that in Bangladesh economy, because that has sort of kept us afloat for a very long time. And it is the government who has invested heavily in that sector in a lot of ways. But the problem is, like, there has been no sort of
development of the national capital. Sorry for the sort of Maoist rant in polite society, but like there has not been a lot of growth of the national capital in Bangladesh. So what has essentially happened is there are people who sort of assemble those products, oftentimes in companies and corporations which did not give the workers even a living wage, and even the promised wages are not given to them. For example, right now there are workers from at least 5 to 6,000 workers whose due wages have not been given to them for the last 3 to 4 months, and they are still protesting. A lot of them have sort of become sick in the boiling heat of Bangladesh that is present right now. And these people are fighting for their basic human rights. They are fighting for not even for higher wages. They are fighting for the wages that they are due. So these are the sort of labor practices that are very, very prevalent in Bangladesh. And what this government has done is this government has simply gone on to subscribe to the model of the IMF model of sort of structural adjustment and sort of cutting down a lot of the state institutions and sort of having less, all that Elon Musk shit that is being done, that's also being done, from Dr. Mahmoud Yunus. But since Dr. Mahmoud Yunus looks like a more respectable figure, there is not as much of critique about it that needs to be there. So I think any sort of reform about Bangladesh economy has to be primarily on the understanding of how we can sort of develop our national capital. Because other than that, what has happened for the last 15 years is that it's not only the fact that they have been very corrupt, the businessmen have been very corrupt. Businessmen are supposed to be corrupt. That's how the system works. But even when they are corrupt, what we essentially needed was them to invest back the money they were getting from those kind of illegal or immoral activities back into the economy. If that had happened, we would have had more jobs, we would have had more sort of mobility in the economy. But for the very nature of that, what happens is the moment they get a amount of extra money, since there is no affordability for those in the consumer market of Bangladesh, they do not have the incentive to invest back in Bangladesh. So what they essentially do is they take that money and invest it somewhere else, or they just ship it off through some banks or something of that nature. And that doesn't necessarily change unless you have a model where you prioritize the development of the national capital in a way that ensures that the capital that is being produced here stays here. Other than that, we are going to sell Walmart and all those companies fast fashion for peanuts, and that's what our economy is essentially going to be. The very same thing can be talked about in terms of the workers who are working abroad, blue collar workers who are working abroad in the Middle Eastern countries and for unbelievably horrific conditions. So that's sort of my general take on the economic reforms of Bangladesh. I don't think there's a lot there, but I will agree with Shehzad Bhai on one thing, that there has been a sort of a good bourgeois management that has essentially ensured that the economy doesn't go crumbling down. Some sort of management has been done so sort of to solidify or consolidate the economy. That's one aspect of it. I think what is very interesting about the electoral reform is how people would, act against their self-interest if they're, if they're afraid enough. So, for example, for the longest time, it has been leftist parties who had been talking about proportional representations and how that is essential. But right now, when the idea of proportional representation is being pitched, we do not see the same amount of enthusiasm from left-wing political parties anymore, because their fear is whatever the long-term effects of this proportional representation might be on the long term. In the short term, what will happen is if you have sort of proportional representation, Jamaat Islami will end up having more seats than they will have if there is no proportional representation. So that fear itself has become so big for a lot of the left and liberals, is that so that they are willing to give away that power to BNP to sort of consolidate that power in a way that they take parliament in a way where they are the majority and they are the sort of unquestioned majority. And that brings back us to square one, because essentially the problem regarding Awami League started when everyone said, you know what, enough with our politics, we will hand over all the power to Awami League, essentially so that they can quash Islamists, because Islamists are in Bangladesh's democracy. Essentially, that role is being taken away by BNP right now. as sort of liberals and leftists are sort of giving away their political agency and power to BNP in terms of sort of quashing the Islamists. Now, what the left should do, I don't really have a constructive answer, because it's very easy to talk about theoretical stuff. But when you're sort of faced with an Islamic fascistic mob everywhere you go and in every institution, it is really hard to sort of, do away with your reactionary fears and sort of stick to the political positions that you've always been stuck with. And essentially, this is meaning that people would rather not go into parliament than rather see Jamaat Islami having 70, 80, 100 seats. Where the country goes on from here, I don't have a clue.
Right. That brings us back to where we started in a nice farcical thematic circle, I think, if you see it that way. We have a hard deadline at 11. So I just want to give some time for the audience questions. If anyone in the audience wants to ask a question by unmuting themselves, please feel free to do so. I believe Parsa can help you do that. Otherwise, I can just simply read out the two questions we got in the chat, and we have about like 5 minutes to respond to them. So either Kabir or Adipto, do you guys want to unmute yourself?
Sure, yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Great, yeah. First of all, Shehzad and Meg, great. Thank you so much for being here today and speaking to us. And Meg, never apologize for being Maoist. That is wonderful. I hope you continue to do that and being unapologetic. I just had a question about, again, moving back to the events of last year. And I wanted to hear more about what are the kind of organizing spaces that students and activists from both sides, be it from the Army League or from the leftist student organizations and the parties, were using? Were these like, because we talk a lot about here in the Turtle Island, or what is also known as Canada, we organize in artistic spaces. We organize when music events are happening, where sports events are happening. Was there a similar kind of opportunity either before July or after July, since where activists and organizers have been able to enter more cultural spaces to then re-narrativize political discourse? Does that make sense? Does the question make sense?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. I think in a lot of cases, this happened before 2024. It has happened for the last 4 to 5 years. And I think the credit has to be given to the likes of Mahfouz Alam and a lot of those people who do not bring to either camp, the left or the right, to sort of have this kind of a new dynamic and sort of a new hegemony of thought regarding what the question of Bangladesh is. And now what had happened at that time was there was a lot of study circles that were being organized in different forms and sort of in different texture. In a lot of cases, a part of the left also participated in this kind of rhetoric and this kind of a understanding of the society, which essentially tries to go beyond the Shapla Shahabak binary and sort of come together on a new basis. And in a lot of cases, that was done by this new organization. Like, that wasn't still formed then, and the NCP. But what was formed at that time was this kind of a discourse, this new discourse, and that sort of culminated through a lot of study circles, formal, informal, in different ways around the country. And that sort of had its importance in the movement, because though people did not know who Mahfouz Alam was, a lot of people were repeating the exact same talking points that Mahfouz Alam had uttered in a lot of those study circles and a lot of those kind of exchange of ideas. And that sort of had a lot of influence on how the July movement was shaped. In terms of study circles, we've always had study circles and we always do a lot of things, but oftentimes though these are more performative in a way that to show, like, it's like more of preaching to the choir rather than sort of engaging new people. So I think that is the new challenge of how do we engage new people into our dialogue, remembering that it's such a polarized society. But I think I've already given the answer to your question.
Okay. Last question, I guess. Maybe Shehzad, you want to take this. So from Aditya in the chat was that attempts to rewrite history in this country, whether it's about the role of Jamaat in 71, or as Meg was saying, or the role of prominent Islamic figures during the Amalik regime, are quite effective in the sense that a large number of people seem to accept these historical revisions. If they are successful in revisionism, right, is there anything that we can sort of do about this? This kind of revisionism that takes place about the roles that certain figures play.
Well, partly Bangladesh is stuck with the tragic legacy of a significant portion of the country, people of the country, being doubtful about whether the country should have ever been born. And that's a peculiar legacy to have. Many post-colonial nation states have some kind of hangover. There's a lot of people who believe that the empires were better, but once you're independent, once you're a new nation state, that's it. But unfortunately for Bangladesh, because of this peculiar history, and precisely because of the way 71 played out, there has always been this counter history about what 71 really was. Now, we grew up during the Awami League BNP cycle, and we know that there were fights over things like the Declaration of Independence and so on. And some of those fights could turn bad, but there was some basic agreements about the overall history of the nation. And questioning whether it was 30 lakh or 3 lakh, re-questioning about how many martyrs were actually killed in 71, questioning about how many women were raped in 71. These were considered fringe questions, and they're no longer fringe questions today. And that is to do with the way the political field has changed over time. And the Awami League has to take blame for that as well, because it took on a job that it didn't perform. It took on the job of settling the question of 71, and it failed to do that. Not only did it fail to do that, it began to, as all the regimes before, pamper the Islamists again. And that's why, as Meg pointed out, many of the loudest voices today were making speeches about how the Awami League is the way, is the future of Bangladesh, and everybody should vote for that. So that's part of the reason. But it's not just Bangladesh. I think there is a shift happening everywhere in the world. It is tied to new right-wing movements, whole effort by Hindutva parties and the Modi regime in particular to rewrite the history of India and basically erase the role of Muslims in India, and as well as blame everything that happened wrong in India on Nehru. So it's not just Bangladesh that this is happening. It's a kind of thing that for some reason that's happening in many parts of the world, and because of the peculiar legacy of Bangladesh, it has a particular flavor here. I don't know what we can do about it. There's a lot of I found it very irritating when after Hasina's fall, people started talking about how we can finally learn the correct history. Man, Rokumari.com was always there. There are books all the time. There's so many excellent historical works about Bangladesh that you could have read. There's a lot of stuff to do, but I think that is not, that's not going to enter the public discourse. And when you have the Awami League regime, which basically monopolized that narrative and basically tried to spoon feed and basically push down Sheikh Mujib and 71 down everybody's throats, and a very selective history of 71 as well, which has no recognition of leftist role and so on. Once you fight that regime, you naturally become suspicious of everything that they said, and that's something that's happening today. A lot of people who are not necessarily prone to conspiracy theories are being prone to those kind of ideas.
Right. With that, we're 2 minutes over time. Thank you to the audience for their questions, and I'd like to say again, thank you to Shehzad and Meg. It's not often that we get to speak, and that's entirely my bad, but it's been lovely hearing you guys talk. Parsa, do you have anything that you'd like to say to close out the event?
Yeah. Oh, can everybody hear me? Okay, so we have an event coming up. We actually have a couple of events coming up about fascism in South Asia, I would say, on May 17th, actually, all tomorrow. One of them by the Institute for the Humanities, 2:30 to 4:30 p.m. I believe it'll be a memorial lecture on India and Israel, partners in genocide. Please check it out. There's a great author that's going to present there, and then the same author will join some other incredible scholar activists, also in Vancouver. Later on in the same day at 5:30 p.m., an event being organized by Weaving Our Worlds, I believe, about Kashmir and everything going on, the military occupation, settler colonialism, etc., in I believe East First 1803. That's the address. So please, if you have time tomorrow, your afternoon, spend it learning about Kashmir and the ascendance of fascism and jingoistic wars. Pretty disappointing stuff I've at least witnessed from some so-called leftists in in the region endorsing this sort of dogma. So thank you all for joining us. Please attend those events tomorrow in person if you can in Vancouver. If you're not in Vancouver, I hope they'll be recorded for you and you can check them out later. Thanks for joining CCMS. I want to thank our panelists and especially thank Azraf for making this event happen. It wouldn't have happened without Azraf. I have to make that very, very clear. And thanks for everybody for joining us. We also have a screening of Janine next week at SFU Burnaby. If you want to check out a really cool documentary about Palestinian resistance against the Israeli occupation, join us for some free popcorn, free pizza, and a great film. So that's it from me. Thank you for joining us.